Good afternoon, everybody, and very welcome to this session, which aims to look at regional access to justice and remediation, and with a particular focus on migrant workers. Thank you to the organizers for having us here for such an important discussion. And I have to commend all of you for still being here after a very long day. So thank you for hanging in there. My name is Archana Kotecha. I'll be your moderator for today, and I'm the CEO and founder of the Remedy Project, which is a social enterprise that focuses on remedial solutions for migrant workers in global supply chains. And I guess I'd like to start by talking a little bit about the ecosystem of Remedy and how diverse this ecosystem is. It's an ecosystem that is rich with state-based judicial mechanisms and state-based non-judicial mechanisms, and also non-state-based mechanisms. You have state actors, you have non-state actors, private sector, trade unions, NGOs, etc. But there are also various other mechanisms like the national human rights institutions, mechanisms that are run by financial sector initiatives, etc. This is a very diverse world of stakeholders, but it is also one that is very fragmented. NGOs are the common denominators, and trade unions too, that often navigate between state-based mechanisms and non-state-based mechanisms as well. And they're also a very important link and a crucial connector between mechanisms and also affected stakeholders. Affected stakeholders are a very important group. And the UNGP's primary focus is the centrality of rights. All of our interventions and all of our actions have to be with the rights holders in mind and with a focus on right holders. We talked about the diverse, ecosystem. We talked about a fragmented ecosystem. Now, the backdrop within which this ecosystem exists is one where you see fractured rule of law, where justice mechanisms are often very hard to access. We see poor enforcement of laws. There are lots of labor laws that exist, but there is poor enforcement. We see an asymmetry of power in terms of, information, access to, to fight really, and also access to mechanisms, access to influence, etc. We also see systems that are discriminatory against workers, whether it is systems that are, inherently discriminatory around the way workers are recruited, the way their living and working conditions are distinct as opposed to local workers. And we also see restrictions on freedom of association, in particular for migrant workers. And that is also a big impediment on access to remedy. And there is, of course, the fear of reprisals, actions taken against human rights defenders, criminal defamation lawsuits against workers as well. Now, within this diverse ecosystem that is fragile, there are emerging opportunities for change. And this is what we really want to talk about today. But I did say that, the centrality of the rights holders is the most key. So I'd like to start this session today by actually going to a very short video, which really encapsulates very clearly the journey of a migrant worker in seeking access to remedy, and we'll then go on to meet the panel. Can we have the video, please?
หานเป็นแรงงานข้ามชาติสัญชาติเมียนมาผู้ซึ่งถูกเลิกจ้างโดยนายจ้างของเขาในประเทศไทย
ยีโน่อะไรเลือดทุกอย่างมูลอยู่ในชีวิตแต่เมื่อฉันเลยนักเทศเลือดทุกอย่างไม่รู้ที่ละไม่รู้มันถึงเงี้ยบัวนะ
คุณรู้ไหมเมื่อแรงงานข้ามชาติถูกเลิกจ้าง1 คนต้องแบกรับอะไรบ้างภาระค่าใช้จ่ายและหนี้สินเท่าเดิมแต่รายได้กลับหายไปด้วยข้อจำกัดทางภาษาของพวกเขาทำให้พวกเขาไม่กล้าขอความช่วยเหลือจากใคร
อาซาและจะต้องมาติวไปทุกสิ่งอุกุญต้องไม่สวมมาติว
การอ่านเขียนหรือพูดภาษาไทยไม่ได้ของแรงงานข้ามชาติส่งผลให้การขอความช่วยเหลือจากหน่วยงานต่างๆจึงเป็นเรื่องที่ยากมูลนิธิ HRDF ได้ให้ความช่วยเหลือตั้งแต่ต้น จนแรงงานข้ามชาติได้รับเงินชดเชย การรวบรวมเอกสาร แปลเอกสาร ประสานงานกับหน่วยงานต่างๆ รวมถึงการเขียนคำร้องเพื่อร้องเรียนต่อเจ้าหน้าที่ ในประเทศไทย องค์กรภาคประชาสังคมส่วนใหญ่ อย่างเช่น HRDF มีบทบาทสำคัญอย่างมากในการสนับสนุนแรงงานข้ามชาติเพื่อเข้าถึงกระบวนการกฎหมายอย่างยุติธรรม
ကျွန်တော်တို့ရဲ့အခွင့်အရေးတွေကိုသိနေဖို့လိုအပ်တယ်တကယ်လို့မသိနေခဲ့ဘူးဆိုရင်လည်းသိဖို့အတွက်ကျွန်တော်တို့ကြိုးစားအားထုတ်ရမယ်ကျွန်တော်တို့မတရားအလုပ်ထုတ်ခံရရင်လည်းငြိမ်ခံမနေဘဲနဲ့နင်းနာမှုတွေအတွက်ကျွန်တော်တို့ထိုက်တဲ့ရောကြီးတွေပြန်နေတောင်းဆိုဖို့လိုအပ်တယ်
I mean, this video really highlights and encapsulates, in a nutshell, the information asymmetry, the difficulties with accessing grievance systems, the role of NGOs in helping workers to navigate this system, and also the knowledge gap that workers often experience around their own rights and the different systems that they can access. On a very personal note, I was really touched to see the number of representatives from Indigenous communities here today. And it is my hope that someday, sometime, that we will not be presenting migrant workers on videos, but rather they will be here to contribute themselves to the debate and how their rights are affected and what they would like to see in terms of change. Now, let me take this opportunity to introduce you to my panel. To my right, I have Tony Cole, who is with NXP. And to my left, to my far left, we have Pepe Siddiqui, who is with with IOM. Now I've lost my notes, so forgive me. So Pepe Siddiqui, who's Senior Regional Migrant Protection and Assistance Specialist with IOM Asia and the Pacific. And next to Pepe is Andriy Sochenko, who leads all the forced labor programs for the International Justice Mission in the region. And Tony, I'll do you justice by reading your full title, which is Director of Corporate Social Responsibility and Sustainability Office with NXP Semiconductors. And online, we have Attorney Celso Hernandez, who is the Director of Market Development with the Department of Migrant Workers of the Government of the Philippines. So I talked earlier about a rich ecosystem, and here you have representatives of pretty much all the different stakeholders, except for workers themselves. And I'd like to really explore, how do we create an enabling environment for access to remedy? And with that, I'd like to talk a little bit about state leadership. There were many instances today where, states had the fingers pointed at them for not doing enough. And it is true that the focus on corporates and on the private sector does not mean that state leadership must fall off the radar. So with that, I'd like to address my first question to Attorney Celso. How can we create a more enabling environment? We want to really draw on the experience of the Philippines. And in a recent regional study conducted by the Remedy Project on behalf of IOM, we highlighted a number of innovative practices which the government of Philippines has undertaken in order to enable access to remedy for migrant workers. In particular, these include the single entry approach system, the SENA, which allows Filipino workers to access different state-based services through a single entry point. They're also able to use online platforms, allowing them to file grievances and seek access to remedy. And there's, of course, the joint and solidarity liability provisions, which is used to hold employment agencies liable for mistreatment of workers in destination countries. So we know that the Philippines has established these robust state-based remediation mechanisms. How is the government of Philippines working with other stakeholders, such as the private sector and civil society, to really strengthen the ecosystem of non-state-based grievance mechanisms for Filipino workers?
Well, first of all, good afternoon, everybody. On the part of the Philippines, for the past 50 years, we were able to create a certain system, and we were able to introduce or innovate mechanisms that will protect all of our workers on site and abroad, and here also in the Philippines. Likewise, we do believe in terms of protection of workers. one of the policy of the government is engaging the tripartite, all the stakeholders, the private enterprises, the recruitment agencies, the non-governmental organization, the worker organizations in the protection of our workers in adopting policies. Right now, maybe I would just like to inform the body that the Philippines has just enacted a law that created the Department of Migrant Workers. This law uh, merged all duty bearers, state duty bearers, on the protection of our workers. And somehow, as you said earlier, we had some innovative mechanism that we introduced to be able to support and to help our workers workers to have access to remedies available to them. One of them is the single entry approach. It's an it's a it's single entry approach is a uh, non uh, non uh, non-judicial approach wherein similar to mediation and conciliation, workers could access the process through our POLO, Philippine Overseas Labor Offices that were established in the destination countries. You could also access it to any office under the Department of Labor and Employment. Right now, on the part of the DMW, since we are not yet in full operation, this process, this SENA, is still being implemented by the Philippines. But somehow, once that we are in full operation, I think we are already drafting a mirror mechanism that will address and will give redress to the concerns and problems being encountered by our workers. Likewise, we also have this. We do have a detailed mechanism in terms of the repatriation of workers. Just 2 months ago, we established the One Repatriation Command Center, where all repatriation requests will be handled by a single center operating almost 24 hours. You could post your request through, or by the request could be made by the workers themselves, or by their next of kin, or even their friends, or even by Filipino communities on site. The request could be through email, through social media platform. The request could also be made through email, social, through a hotline, a 24/7 hotline. Also have a 24/7 hotline. Likewise, we do have this polo. Under the new law, this polo will be ready into Migrant Workers Office. This is being headed by the Labor Attaché. It provides a wide array of services for our workers, as well as to foreign employers and to other clients. And part of it is the welfare services that being given by the Polo. Polo usually have this shelter for those runaway workers, to those who were abused, and Polo would always part of Polo is the function of the Polo is to conduct this mediation and conciliation. The part of this Polo is also to help the workers to access remedies that are available in the destination countries. Most of the time, uh, we uh, we do have under our law the legal assistance fund that is being given to the Department of Foreign Affairs. But somehow in our new law, aside from the legal assistance fund that being handled by the Department of Foreign Affairs, we also have this so-called action fund, an action fund that will be used by the Department of Migrant Workers to assist workers in distress. So that's one thing that is being uh, facilitated by the Polo, as well as the repatriation request of the workers. Uh, Actually, there are some cases that where workers would opt not to pursue any claims or any case at the destination country, and they just wanted to just be returned to the country, returned to the Philippines, and that's one thing that is peculiar peculiar in our system is the so-called joint and solidary liability of the agencies in with their employers. We impose this on the reason that once an employer would not pay all the money claims, the benefits of wages to worker, and once a worker filed it against the employer here, definitely it will be impossible to go after the employers here in the Philippines under our process. So the our law made it clear that the deploying agency will be joint and solidarily liable to the money claims that will be adjudged against the foreign employer. As part of their license, we do have this so-called escrow cap. This one is just it's 1 million pesos. And depending on the number of the cases that they have, this escrow account could be increased. They also need to secure surety bond, wherein workers could also proceed in case that they would win their money claims against the workers.
Celso, can I stop you there, because there's a lot of really rich information there. So you talked about the tripartite nature of the engagement that you have with NGOs, the private sector, and the importance of being responsive to the needs of workers. So, for example, the creation of POLO, the streamlining of repatriation services, etc. Many of these are issues that really were highlighted during COVID, with workers needing to be repatriated, with people returning from destination countries suddenly with claims outstanding and no way of dealing with it. So many of these measures are commendable, and there is much in here to learn for other states as well. I'd like to turn to Pepe on that note and really talk about, cross-border issues present very significant challenges for workers. What role can organizations like the IOM play in building this enabling environment, in particularly around support in accessing remedy, in terms of remediation of cross-border grievances, both through state-based and also non-state-based mechanisms?
Thanks, Archana. Before I get into the question, I just wanted to have a quick question to the audience. Could I just have a show of hand of those of you who work either with migrants or migration-related issues, just to get a read of the room as to how many of us here are on migration? Okay. And I really commend the rest of you for staying for the last session of the day. Thank you. Okay, so I wanted to quickly talk about just the state of migration in Asia Pacific, some of the vulnerabilities and challenges of migrant workers accessing remedy, and then moving on to the solutions. I think it's, of course, important to keep in mind that labor migration really is one of the economic pillars driving growth in Asia Pacific. It's very much understood to be that by most of the Asia Pacific governments as well. The latest migration data that we have say that there are about 169 million international labor migrants globally, and out of that, 24 million reside inside Asia Pacific. These are regular migrants that are somehow captured by state data collection mechanisms. We also just got the latest global estimates on modern slavery come out, which say that there are about 15 million victims of forced labor in Asia Pacific. So if you look at the number of regular migrants, 24 million, and then you look at the number of victims of forced labor, 15 million in Asia Pacific, the data tells a story. It's not all of the story necessarily, because of course some of this data is misleading, but there's certainly some questions there that can be asked around the protection of migrant workers in this region and access to vital services like remedy and grievance mechanisms. On top of that, Asia Pacific is also characterized by prevalent degrees of irregular migration. So we don't really know what that number is, but it's likely to be as high, if not higher, than the regular migration number. And of course, irregular migrants are particularly vulnerable to challenges that migrants that have migrated under kind of regularized pathways are not. For example, irregular migrants are often excluded from accessing protection available by national law, certainly couldn't access things like labor courts or criminal courts, are under constant threat of being reported to authorities and deported, and so would also be prevented from seeking any sort of access to protection services. So with that in mind, Oh, and of course, then the COVID returns, I think, really brought into the forefront some of these challenges that were faced by migrants, whether regular or irregular, again, because there were such large number of returns associated then with labor rights violations, whether that was non-payment of wages or unlawful dismissals or retention of papers, but really came to the front with COVID and the pandemic-related migrants who returned home. So with that in mind, looking at some of the grievance mechanisms, whether state-based, non-state-based, they're not seen often by migrants as viable means for resolving their grievances. And there are plentiful of challenges around here, but a lot of it has to do with trust issues, language barriers, limited information of what these grievance mechanisms are all about, fear of retaliation, loss of employment. Of course, migrants' right to stay in a country is almost always tied to a work permit. And if that work permit is lost, if the employer terminates that work relationship, then the migrant goes home. And then again, the question comes to how does the migrant then seek redressal for what's happened when they're no longer in the same country or the same jurisdiction with the employer. Non-state-based grievance mechanisms where available often are not seen to have legitimacy with the migrant workers. They feel that there are major power imbalances with regards to, particularly if those non-state-based grievance mechanisms are managed by the employer, that the migrants are not fairly represented, that they're not understood, that they're not necessarily useful outcomes that come out of those grievance mechanisms, or that they're not well communicated to the migrants. And migrants often express a preference for liaising with their own community or having informal negotiations with their employers, trying to sort of have a dialogue to see whether their issues can be solved. And if not, a migrant is also probably more likely to change employer than seek some sort of formal adjudication on the case. So the need for cross-border remedy arises particularly in situations of these types of unlawful dismissals, but there is no international legal framework that covers cross-border access to grievance mechanisms or redressal. And so it's very challenging to really enable migrant workers to access these remediation mechanisms. And often we see that actually in practice, access to these type of remedies is achieved mostly through informal networks, through engagement of CSOs, trade unions, migrant resource centers also, which are centers usually established together with the government and maybe an NGO or UN partner. And they then informally or through their established networks can support the claimants navigate the patchwork of available grievance mechanisms, which can be quite difficult or very difficult to understand for the migrants. So all of those challenges on the table, there are some promising practices. I think we heard from one from the Philippines already, which is very interesting actually, because it looks at putting the joint solidarity liability puts, although it holds foreign employers and Philippines recruitment agencies jointly liable, it really looks at the recruitment agencies to be in charge of seeking that redressal, because they're seen as having more agency and power to seek remedy than the migrant worker. So the migrant worker approaches their recruitment agency for remedy, and then the recruitment agency could theoretically seek that remedy from the employer. It's of course not perfect. It leaves the local recruiters responsible for grievances that they were not party to, but at least it allows the migrant to access some type of remedy where there is no real access to cross-border remediation. We see that these migrant resource centers, or MRCs, which have been established in this region pretty well across countries. We have them in Thailand, Malaysia, Cambodia, Vietnam. They have been, and they're usually kind of focused at supporting industrial disputes and labor claims, have been fairly good at trying to support migrants' access to remedy when it's about, for example, non-payment of wages or some sort of labor claim that the migrant launched. And they have these networks amongst each other, so they are able to support the migrants' access to other CSO partners as well as possible labor disputes. One of the real challenges for migrants, of course, once they've returned home, and if the remedy is provided in a labor court, for example, in the country of destination where they worked, is that you have to be present in person to be able to represent yourself. and you can't be present because you no longer have the right to stay in the country. There is some work going on in Hong Kong to look at, for example, the use of video links so that the migrants could represent themselves remotely, which is very interesting. I mean, I don't think this has been solved yet, but that would certainly allow migrants to then have access to cross-border remediation. But there again, I mean, you have translation issues, language issues, the need for some sort of representation, having the financial means to have all of that. So it's not all solved yet. Where we look at criminal justice issues, I'll be almost done. Okay. Particularly with regards to victims of trafficking, there is more established agreement between governments on access to protection services and remediation. For example, there's an existing MOU between Thailand and Cambodia that really kind of has mutual recognition of who is a victim of trafficking and what type of assistance they should be provided with. But it's easier on the criminal justice side than it is on the softer law side. And I think with that, I think, of course, for IOM, I mean, we have a host of tools. So there is guidance and tools to be offered both to our government counterparts and private sector and civil society in terms of what does operational grievance look like? How do we include the civil society in that? You know, how do we work with different partners to make sure that migrants have access to that? But I think there's a lot to do still with regards to the state's role as well in facilitating cross-border access to grievance. And that's something that, you know, needs to be facilitated across the board, whether that's engagement with ASEAN or government counterparts, but ensuring that we get there. Thank you.
And, you know, I think that's an excellent segue for the fact that, you know, I think states must challenge themselves a little bit more. The movement of people benefits the state immensely, just as much as it is important for the private sector and as it is important for migrant workers themselves. Therefore, do MOUs present, or bilaterals between governments, present an opportunity to have better labor protections in them and inbuilt mechanisms which workers can access in order to protect themselves, particularly where something goes wrong under that migration movement? This is particularly important because actually there isn't one way of looking at access to remedy here. There isn't just one stakeholder that is responsible. It's a complex problem. It's something that speaks around labor market dynamics, migration, and a whole host of issues. Therefore, there needs to be a multi-layered approach to it. But I want to come back to something Pepi talked about earlier, which was the trust issues. And very often in engagement with migrant workers, they will tell you that why should the company design a system where they are the judge, the jury, and the defendant? How can we trust a system like that? We were not consulted in the design of that system. We are not involved in running it as well. So why should we trust that this system can deliver for us what we need by way of remedy? So with that, Tony, I know you've been doing quite a lot of work at NXP. I want to hear a bit from you about your experience in setting up these mechanisms for workers, and to what extent have you been engaging these workers in your work?
Thank you, Archana, and it's an honor to be here and representing business. So I'm Tony Kaur. I'm based in Singapore. I'm from NXP Semiconductors. So we have, we are a semiconductor manufacturing company. We have operations in Asia. We have a factory here in Bangkok. We have operations that employ migrant workers. We recruit from migration corridors like Malaysia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines to Taiwan. Yeah, and also from China to Singapore. So, and we also have supply chain partners in this region that rely on migrant worker to power their factories. So, Achana, I tend to, I warn you, I tend to go off script in a lot of my session. Because I think we need to see where the conversation flows, and I think the video that that was shown at the beginning of this session resonates with me because it's a reality on the ground. We've done a lot of due diligence in our supply chain, and what you see in the video is real, especially in times of COVID, where we know a lot of migrant workers have lost their jobs. and was stranded in a foreign country, and how do they seek a remedy? So we have worked a lot in our supply chain, and we have, we can, as a business, we can talk about the kind of remedy process we provide to workers. Some work, some don't work. I'm going to be realistic, but one of the key areas that when we do due diligence is worker interviews. So in 10 years that we've done due diligence in our supply chain, we have interviewed close to about 5,000 workers, and a majority of them migrant workers. And we know we fully understand the challenges that they face, because migrant workers are the most vulnerable the moment they are recruited to when they transit from their home country to the sending country. We see issues, still seeing issues of recruitment fees being collected from migrant workers, their passports confiscated once they arrive at the host country. We see contract, the change in their contract or contract substitution. They will promise something in their home country. When they reach their host country, their jobs change, everything change. So every time we interview workers, we will provide them with a number to call, right? In case what we're worried about is retaliation against these workers, right? So we will provide them a number to call where they can access a line where they can report any concerns that they have. And we are pleased to state here that workers do use these lines. For example, I'll state two examples. When COVID happened, we have a contractor, a cafeteria contractor that employed Bangladeshi workers, and some of these the service provider actually laid off these workers. The workers actually called these numbers. The workers were not actually working in an NXP facility. They were working in other facility, but they know of the number that NXP provides. They called the number. They said that they are stranded. They are running out of food. So what we did was our team in Malaysia actually called out, reached out to our contractor and asked them to meet with us to find out what's the situation. And then we worked with a local civil society organization in Malaysia to reach out to the workers to provide them with necessary support in terms of providing them with food and checking on them every day to check on their well-being, right? So we made sure that they are given their last drawn salary, they are fully paid their salary and their benefits, and the CSO actually followed through until they have safely reached home, right? So we are doing this by ourselves, right? This is just us, right? And and that we're just barely scraping the surface. And one of the things that we do, I think we hear throughout this the day of this forum is the word awareness. I think it's not the issue of awareness with businesses, but it's raising awareness with migrant workers. Before COVID, about 3 to 4 years ago, we actually went into where we recruit workers in Indonesia. Went into the villages to visit the vocational schools where these workers are recruited from after they graduate. We actually met with their principal, the headmasters, the teachers, and also together with an NGO partner that we work with, we met with the graduating class, and we actually gave them an awareness session, a training session, to help them know what their rights are if they choose to work in overseas, if they choose to become a migrant worker to work overseas. And I think, but that's just very a small portion of the work we do. And I think I like to call out of call to action, collaboration that we need to have here, right? So we, as a business, we're willing to partner with whether it's IOM, with CSOs to really go out there and raise this awareness. I think we need to address this at the source before the workers actually become, choose to work as a migrant workers. Help them understand their rights, help them understand where they can get access to remedy. And I'll stop here. I think I've got 12 years of experience to share, and I don't think we have enough time here. But
Please come and find him at break time, or possibly tomorrow morning.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony. I think that was a very honest sharing of your experiences, but I think that also highlighted something very critical, which is the collaboration between private sector, workers, CSOs, etc. Because no one in this ecosystem can be delivering solutions on their own, and the role of collaboration is so important. And actually there are trust issues, not just between employers and employees, but also between the private sector and the NGO world as well. And, we often in the course of my work, we encounter a lot of issues around, well, how can we trust this NGO? How do we work with them? How do we find partners who we can really partner with in delivering access to remedy? So with that, and Andrea, I think this is a great segue for you. Can you share some perspectives from your work and experience at IJM on how migrant workers can be engaged more actively in the building of these pathways to remedy?
Thanks. Thanks, Archana, and thank you to the organizers for including me and IJM in the group. Indeed, we have unpacked a host of reasons why we wouldn't trust each other in this space, and why migrant workers in particular, rights holders, would be ill-advised to trust, right? And the lack of trust goes all directions, right? Government doesn't trust business, business doesn't trust government, NGOs don't trust business or government. I think there's a lot of mistrust to go around. But if we are going to come up with solutions, we are going to have to do it together. As we've highlighted, there's no one group that's going to be able to solve all the problems. We may have good intentions, but we don't have all the power. And that goes for everybody. And I think, so we're going to have to collaborate. We're going to have to meet each other on the common ground. And largely we do have common ground, because it really is in all of our best interests to take care of the rights holders and to eliminate human rights violations from supply chains and from our workforce. And I think at a basic level, those who are working in this space all understand that. A couple of initial points, and then I'd like to talk about a couple of ways I think that rights holders can actually contribute more meaningfully. And the initial point, I guess, is that while we all have a key role to play, if we're talking about sustainability and we're talking about scaling solutions to be more broadly available, we have to say that the state-based mechanisms are going to be the long-term foundation, both for remedy, but also for the protection of migrant workers. We're talking about, when we talk about human rights violations, we're talking about criminal actions. And criminal actions to provide disincentives for those ongoing long pattern of criminal actions. There will have to be a criminal justice response or a labor protection system response. There will have to be some state-based system to disincentivize criminal actors who are operating in those operations. And so that's something that none of the other actors in this space can substitute for. And so we do need the states to take, as Archana said earlier, a leadership role in this space. And I think there are promising practices and there are signs that it can work. As we've said, there are a patchwork of different avenues towards remedy. And organizations, good organizations like HRDF in the video that we showed earlier, are doing great work to connect migrant workers with those patchwork of benefits. So I'd like to just outline a few ways that migrant workers, rights holders can actually access or can actually help build and scale. One of those is to find and participate in the available grievance mechanisms or state-based approaches. And so local NGOs are already doing this and can continue to do that more. And we can find ways to connect with migrant worker communities. We at IJM are connected with migrant communities and with survivors. We're also connected with local partners in the countries we work in across the region. And so that's what we do. We have teams of people who walk with migrant workers and with local partners through individual cases, just like the one on the video with HRDF. And I think showing that those grievance mechanisms or state-based mechanisms can actually work is an important step to showing that that these can also be built further, right? And going through the experience of using those grievance mechanisms can also show where the gaps are and where there need to be continuous improvement. So then the second thing I was going to note is that it's important to listen to the migrant workers, the rights holders themselves. And I think that's why I really appreciate this research that the Remedy Project has done. And we'll really look forward to the release of that report because it will directly come from the mouths of those who have experienced migrant work. And I think we can take care also about the timing when we get those when we get those experiences. I think oftentimes grievance mechanisms that I've been familiar with take opinions or views of migrant workers during the recruitment process or during the employment process. But maybe, at least in my experience, we haven't done as much to get the experience of migrant workers after they've been repatriated or after they've already experienced the going through the criminal justice system or the labor protection system, the labor courts, to go back to them afterwards and find out, well, how was that experience? What was good and what was bad? What could have been better? And I think one more is that I think it's powerful. In my experience, it's powerful when rights holders get together to advocate for their rights as groups. And so one of the things that we're doing at IJM is trying to build survivor groups in all of the countries where we're working, both survivors and also vulnerable community members to come together and work on empowerment. So that may be different kinds of empowerment, maybe economic empowerment, it may be social connection empowerment, it may be empowerment and advocating for rights with local legislative bodies or others. So we have a lot of great examples where survivor groups have become effectively their own local NGO and started kicking off rescue operations, filing compensation petitions, accompanying other survivors to justice system processes. I think there's a lot of power in survivor empowerment and survivor advocates, and I hope that we will look to the rights holders. As Archana said, it will be wonderful to see more rights holders from the migrant worker space better represented on these panels and in forums in the future. So looking forward to that.
Actually, what you say really accords with some of the findings of research conducted by the IOM in partnership with the Scalabrini Migration Center. We referred to some of the findings in the research that we did for IOM very recently. And that really highlights that a number of, it was a research covering Filipino workers who returned home and who then filed claims. And there was an overwhelming percentage who chose to go to state-based mechanisms where state-based mechanisms were available and were able to work efficiently to a degree. That was their preference. Another interesting finding of the research we did was that migrant workers very much preferred to go to consensus-based approaches as opposed to adversarial-based approaches. And any system that was timely, that was reasonably transparent and accessible, and was state-based was a preference. So that we felt was very interesting. Celso, perhaps this is a good time to turn back to you very briefly. If you could share, having put forward various interesting initiatives that the Philippines has been leading on, what have been some of your key learnings that other states could be learning from in relation to POLO and even the Joint Solidarity Law?
It's more of looking on how we could really effectively address the concerns and the issues and to give redress and remedy to the problems being encountered by the workers, whether it's on site or here in the Philippines. And most of the time is more of communicating to our workers that the remedy is not only at the destination country, but also here with the engagement or with some innovative mechanism, we could help them achieve to have access to justice even here in the Philippines. Even as what like what we have said, there are a lot of distrust, there are a lot of cases, there are a lot of problems being encountered by our migrant workers in the destination countries in terms of access to justice. Hence, on the part of the Philippines, is more of uh, putting a lot of innovations, putting a lot of protective mechanisms, putting a lot of uh, different systems to be able to support our migrant workers here in the Philippines as well as in abroad. That's how we operate our polos, our migrant workers office, our Philippine overseas labor offices, and likewise that's how we work on our uh, mediation and conciliation system. We also have various remedies, administrative remedies in terms of filing cases against recruitment agencies, blacklisting of and blacklisting of employers. All of these things, even if the worker would opt to return to the Philippines, they could avail of these remedies. Maybe that's one thing that is very unique in our system. It's having uh, both having these remedies, uh, having this process accessible not only on site but also here in the Philippines. Hence, there will be no there will be more opportunity for the workers to uh, pursue justice and seek redress to their problems. Likewise, that will not force our OFWs or overseas Filipino workers to stay abroad and be subjected to different untoward incidents being such as the lengthy process about being and other issues that they had on site. Maybe that's how we look on our process here in the Philippines.
Thank you, Celso. That's really helpful. And you really highlight the importance of a variety of remedies, a variety of mechanisms that complement each other. And very much, if you look at the teachings of the UN Guiding Principles, it really is about providing a healthy mix of systems and remedies that complement each other. There was a session earlier today about translating the UN Guiding Principles into daily practice. And the UN Guiding Principles are really a framework for operation. And the importance of contextualizing in order to be able to really fulfill the needs of affected stakeholders is something that is quite difficult. Pepe, what in your experience or what have you learned about this bridging the gap, and how do we bridge the gap between what international standards are setting out, and very often companies say we are abiding by international standards, and where local standards are actually at a much lower level, and that leaves a gap in between, which leaves the affected stakeholders very vulnerable to exploitation. How can we navigate that space, and how do we really contextualize the application of international standards at a local level?
With regards to, again, sort of realistic access to remedy for the migrant workers, I mean, we, of course, when we talk about remedy, we base it on the UN Guiding Principles, we base it on the Pillar 3, which comes with very clear guidance as to what effective remedy looks like. I think there's been a little bit of, some of our CSO partners tend to disagree with some of the private sector engagement in this space, saying that they see that this is a privatization of justice by private sector, and that's not ideal, and it's not in keeping with international principles as well. But I do think that there's a very important role here with regards to how the private sector engages in this space, and how that is then linked to the state-based mechanisms, what the states can provide. I mean, you mentioned earlier, Archana, that this is ensuring a multi-layered, multi-party accountability, but perhaps the most neglected entity in all of that currently still are the migrants themselves and their ownership of these grievance processes, how they get to have a say as to what's meaningful for them. Recognizing that a lot of the state-based mechanisms are still somewhat out of reach for migrants, whether that's because of balance of power problems or language issues. And migrants' interest often is to remain in country and continue working. I also think that we really have to look at what provides meaningful remedy for the migrants themselves. and what is it that they want. And sometimes that may not be fully in keeping, even, to be a little bit controversial, but with the internationally accepted best practice with regards to what remedy looks like. And we may have to be a little bit creative in ensuring that the migrants have access to what they need. But I spoke so much earlier, I'm going to keep that.
It's very kind of you. Andre, maybe turning to you, one of the findings of the research that we did was also very much around the fact that there isn't much complementarity between state-based and non-state-based systems. So for example, where in non-state-based systems, we're coming across problems like trafficking, forced labor, these are criminal offenses. They're very rarely being referred on to state authorities to be dealt with in the correct way. So what more can be done in order to promote a better complementarity between state and non-state-based systems?
Okay, so that's a fantastic question. And I think, I don't have the answer because the solution hasn't been well created, I don't think. The reality is it's true, right? There's a lot of information about the reality of human rights violations in supply chains that exists in confidential reports of audits or in sometimes in even among migrant communities. People will know a lot of information, but that information isn't necessarily shared with state-based agencies for lots of different valid reasons. And so, the question about what can be done to build those linkages is a question that relates to structure, but it's also a question that relates to trust. And that's why this issue of trust is important. It's important for us to acknowledge that we're all operating with different incentives and disincentives and risks, right? For the business to, I'm not going to speak for Tony, but the reality that we know is that if a business is sitting on information about major crimes that are committed within its supply chain, there may be some disincentives to sharing that information publicly, right? There may be some worries about legal risk or reputational risk that would come along with that. One of the panelists earlier talked about, well, if this gets into the legal department of some of these corporations, some things may get bogged down on the internal processes. And that's true, right? Governments also don't have an incentive to see case numbers rise a lot, right? A lot of governments in the area would like to be able to say, yeah, we've solved our forced labor problems. And so if we see a larger number of cases be reported, some governments have different ideas about whether that's a good or bad thing, right? And workers themselves, rights holders have their own risks, and they have the most risks in filing cases personally regarding their future livelihood, ability to get back to home countries or return to their place of migration that they want to migrate. So everyone has risks. I guess what I'd like to suggest is that I'd like to ask if anybody has any good suggestions. You can, for mechanisms to allow for better referral of cases from let's say non-state-based to state-based mechanisms where there's a serious crime committed, right? Let's say we're talking about these are major organized crime, syndicated crimes sometimes that are happening that need a criminal justice response in order to disincentivize that behavior. But to get it to the state-based mechanism in a way that will cause success in the state-based mechanism is quite challenging. So all ideas appreciated. I would say, I think there are ways, and then some of those ways might be through one hint of a solution, or an idea might be some type of reports through other organizations that also work with justice system actors. It might be referral of partial amounts of information that could be verified independently and separately. It might be anonymized reports. But because we know that there are civil society organizations supporting rights holders in all kinds of ways, right? Including legal guidance, translation, navigating the various options for access to remedy. And so let's use all the resources at our disposal out there. Thanks.
Thanks, Andre. And I had one last question for Tony before opening up for questions. I'm going to be very naughty and abuse my prerogative as a moderator to ask you a question that I had not planned for you.
Okay.
And that question comes as a result of a statement Surya Deva made earlier on one of his panels. And again, it comes down to this trust deficit. It's very interesting. The whole idea of the UN Guiding Principles is it's about business understanding its impact on human rights. However, very often when in the way businesses behave and respond to risks, it's almost as if it's human rights risks, it's business risk from human rights that are being managed, if you see what I mean.
Reputationally.
So how can we ensure that the eyes are always on the prize and that the rights holders and the centrality of the rights holders always remains the key focus and not simply your bottom line and your reputational and your financial risks, because I think that does impact the type of solutions you roll out.
Right. So yeah, it's throwing me a curveball as a result of me always going off script. So I appreciate that, but hey, we started our journey through discovery. We discovered we have forced labor in our own operations, right? So do we keep a blind eye? No, we can't, right? So this was escalated to our CEO, to our executive management team. We found out that the migrant workers in our facilities, this was 12 years ago, paid close to about $1 million worth of fees. And so we decided that as a business, we have to repay the migrant workers the recruitment fees that they have paid to labor agents. And as a result of that, we put a very stringent set of standards together. We are probably one of the first few companies that started the employer pays policy, right? So we went direct recruiting. Direct recruitment, we don't recruit through labor agents. We go to the country to do direct recruitment ourselves. We issue the contract ourselves, right? We ensure that they reach to our host country safely. We receive them at the airport, and then we make sure that we are accountable for the safety. So that's us. We made sure that we can do that right before we go out to the supply chain to tell them that, hey, you need to be aligned with our own values, right? And actually, when talk about transparency, when I was speaking, my phone buzzed, and we're actually doing a due diligence in Malaysia right now. My colleague who is in Malaysia just sent me the results of a supplier that the Bangladeshi workers, they're paid in excess of 19,000 Malaysian ringgit in recruitment fees. Right, this is the highest violation against our NXP standards. And what we do is we'll go to the supplier and say, you need to repay the workers, right? You need to repay. And then I think coming back to Andre is like, if so far we haven't had the need to escalate, right? The need to go to a state-based mechanism or to seek redress, but we have been able to work with our suppliers to really look at remediation for the workers, right? So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but yeah, thank you.
Thank you for being so candid, Tony. And actually, I must say, I really commend you for being here, because it's not easy to find a private sector representative who is prepared to sit here and make the statements and the sharing that you have. So I really commend you for that. And I know that this is a space which is fraught with challenges and difficulties. What we tried to showcase to you is there are challenges, but there are also pockets of good practice. There is so much opportunity to do more and to scale up. But I'll come back to our panelists for some final thoughts in a moment. I just want to open it up for questions. So if you could kindly put your hand up if you have a question, keep it concise, please introduce yourselves, and look forward to hearing questions both from the audience here and also online if you have any. Questions? Can I go with you first?
Thank you very much. Very good presentation. In regard to like grievance handling mechanism, informal, I would say, or say like semi, like judicial mechanism. The best way could be to have good network among national human rights institutions, so that they could at least kind of exchange the information about the violation of human rights. That's one thing. The second thing could be again, like if there is an MOU reached out, at least between or say among the NHRIs, they could work together to investigate the issue. That could be one of the good examples. And in Nepal, we have at least tried to kind of experiment it. And we have Secretary of National Human Rights Commission, he could share more about. And there are a few NHRIs, they have been working together to monitor, to collect the issues, and at the same time try to resolve it out. That is one thing. Second thing is at like normative level, it could also be beneficial to have the ratification of this migrant workers related convention, so that can at least create an enabling environment to interact and resolve the issues out. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. That's really the very interesting and very valuable suggestions. And I think the normative framework is so important because that's where we generally derive everything from, whether it's the definition of an offense, whether it's, how we will respond to it, etc. So thank you for that. Next one, can I take yours?
ขอบคุณค่ะสุกันตาสุขไผ่ตานะคะเป็นผู้ก่อตั้งกลุ่มคนงานหญิงเพื่อความยุติธรรมนะคะอยู่พื้นที่ภาคเหนือของประเทศไทยสมาชิกส่วนใหญ่ของกลุ่มเป็นแรงงานข้ามชาติ 90% เป็นแรงงานข้ามชาตินะคะเราพบในการพูดถึงหลักการชี้แนะที่จะให้เกิดกลไกการเยียวยาที่เหมาะสมกับแรงงานข้ามชาติในประเทศไทยเราคิดว่าสิ่งที่มันเกิดขึ้นสถานการณ์ที่มันเกิดขึ้นในประเทศไทยอย่างที่วิดีโอตอนต้นส่วนหนึ่งนะคะอีกส่วนหนึ่งเนี่ยเรามองว่าพระราชกำหนดบริหารจัดการการทำงานของคนต่างด้าวของประเทศไทยเนี่ยมันคล้ายๆกับใบอนุญาตให้ใช้แรงงานบังคับในประเทศไทยนะคะเพราะว่าพรก.บริหารจัดการแรงงานข้ามชาติในแรงงานต่างด้าวในประเทศไทยนั้นเนี่ยกำหนดให้บริษัทโบรกเกอร์มีอำนาจเหนือแรงงานข้ามชาติเพราะบริษัทโบรกเกอร์ที่นำแรงงานข้ามชาติมาให้ในจ้างใช้เนี่ยจะมีอำนาจว่าถ้าลูกจ้างต้องการย้ายในจ้างจะต้องกลับไปหาบริษัทโบรกเกอร์บริษัทนั้นให้ทำหน้าที่ย้ายให้นะคะทำให้ลูกจ้างเนี่ยต้องเสียเงินซ้ำซ้อนนะคะประการที่สองในกรณีที่เป็นเหยื่อของการค้ามนุษย์ประเทศไทยสาเหตุที่ไม่มีสถิติการค้ามนุษย์ในแรงงานอาจจะเป็นเพราะสาเหตุนี้ก็ได้เพราะว่าเหยื่อการค้ามนุษย์ในแรงงานเนี่ยถ้าแรงงานเปิดตัวเองว่าเป็นเหยื่อเขาจะถูกผลักดันกลับนะคะดังนั้นเนี่ยค่าใช้จ่ายที่เขากว่าจะเดินทางมาได้ในประเทศไทยเนี่ยเขาต้องเดือดร้อนมากเขาต้องขายบ้านขายที่ดินมาแล้วถูกผลักดันกลับเพราะเป็นเหยื่อค้ามนุษย์โดยที่เขาไม่รู้ว่าเขาเป็นเหยื่อเพราะถูกหลอกมาเนี่ยพอเสร็จแล้วมาโดนจับในประเทศไทยบอกว่าเป็นเหยื่อการค้ามนุษย์ในแรงงานเขาต้องถูกส่งกลับซึ่งกฎหมายเนี่ยไม่เป็นธรรมสำหรับพวกเราเลยเพราะเมื่อเขาถูกส่งกลับค่าใช้จ่ายที่เขาเสียมาขายบ้านขายที่ดินแล้วเขากลับไปจะอยู่ยังไงนะคะแล้วโอกาสที่เขาจะได้กลับมาอีกครั้งหนึ่งเนี่ยก็ยากมากเพราะมันหมดแล้วทรัพย์สินเงินทองของเขามันหมดตัวแล้วนะคะนี่ประการหนึ่งที่ทำให้สถิติการค้ามนุษย์ในแรงงานของประเทศไทยเนี่ยมันไม่ถูกเปิดเผยเพราะแรงงานเองเนี่ยกลัวว่าจะถูกส่งกลับแล้วหาในจ้างใหม่ไม่ได้นะคะบริษัทในหน้าที่มีอำนาจเหนือพวกเขาเวลาที่เปลี่ยนในจ้างเขาจะต้องให้บริษัทในหน้าเนี่ยเป็นคนมาดำเนินการให้โดยกฎหมายในเขียนไว้อย่างนั้นดังนั้นเนี่ยทำให้แรงงานข้ามชาติในประเทศไทยเนี่ยต้องเสียเงินซ้ำซ้อนคือเสียแล้วครั้งแรกเพื่อที่จะเข้ามาในประเทศไทยยังไม่จบนะจริงๆแล้วเขาควรจะเสียครั้งเดียวแล้วก็หน้าที่ของบริษัทโบรกเกอร์เนี่ยมันต้องดำเนินการฟรีทั้งหมดหลังจากนั้นแต่เขาไม่ได้ดำเนินการฟรีเขาต้องเสียเงินทุกครั้งที่กลับไปหาบริษัทโบรกเกอร์นะนี่
Thank you. That has been a very good insight. I actually have a question for you from our panelists. Can he just ask you his question?
Thank you. Can I ask you a question about that? Because thank you for bringing that up. Thank you for bringing that up. And NXP, as I told, as I informed you, and NXP, we have an operation in Thailand, and we don't employ, currently we don't employ any migrant workers, they're all local workers. And supply chain partners that we have visited, they have also all employed local workers. But my question to you is, you said it's the law that if you want to employ migrant workers, you have to go through labor agents. But can the law allow companies to hire direct without going through labor agent?
ได้ค่ะเพราะว่าการนำเข้าแรงงานข้ามชาติในประเทศไทยมี2วิธีคือผ่านบริษัทโบรกเกอร์กับตัวในจ้างเองไปดำเนินการซึ่งตัวในจ้างเองไปดำเนินการเนี่ยมันยุ่งยากมากในการยื่นขอเนมลิสต์ขอต่างๆนานาจากกระทรวงเนี่ยกว่าจะผ่านใช้เวลานานมากทำให้ในจ้างปัดความรำคาญโดยใช้บริษัทโบรกเกอร์แทนมันก็ก่อให้เกิดค่าใช้จ่ายฝั่งนู้นที่แพงมากกว่าที่เขาจะมาเมืองไทยได้นะแล้วถ้ามาเจอคดีว่าเป็นเหยื่อค้ามนุษย์เนี่ยเขาต้องถูกผลักดันกลับเขาก็จะไม่บอกเราว่าเขาถูกค้ามนุษย์นี่คือวิธีการที่คนที่จำนวนที่เราเชื่อว่าจำนวนสถิติการค้ามนุษย์ในแรงงานในประเทศไทยไม่มีเพราะลูกจ้างแรงงานข้ามชาติไม่กล้าบอกว่าตัวเองถูกหลอกมานะคะเรามองว่ากลไกที่เป็นธรรมเนี่ยดิฉันมองว่าเรื่องของการรัฐเองเนี่ยบทบาทของรัฐจะต้องส่งเสริมความรู้ให้คนงานก่อนที่จะเข้ามาในประเทศเนี่ยได้รู้พื้นฐานกฎหมายที่เกี่ยวข้องแล้วก็สามารถเข้าถึงสิทธิ์ได้นะคะแล้วก็ทุกหน่วยงานที่เกี่ยวข้องเพื่อความยุติธรรมเนี่ยหรือการหน่วยงานที่ต้องเยียวยาเขาเนี่ยควรจะต้องมีล่ามภาษาของเขาเพราะปัจจุบันในประเทศไทยไม่มีนะคะแล้วก็มีเจ้าหน้าที่คอยอำนวยความสะดวกเช่นเวลาที่วิดีโอตอนแรกเวลาไปยื่นคำร้องต่อสำนักงานสวัสดิการและคุ้มครองแรงงานเนี่ยเขาไม่มีเจ้าหน้าที่ที่จะเขียนคำร้องให้ลูกจ้างแรงงานข้ามชาติดังนั้นเนี่ยเมื่อลูกจ้างแรงงานข้ามชาติประสบปัญหาในจ้างไม่ปฏิบัติตามกฎหมายคุ้มครองแรงงานหรือกฎหมายต่างๆที่เกี่ยวข้องเนี่ยเขาเขียนคำร้องเองไม่ได้เขาก็จะถูกเจ้าหน้าที่ไล่บอกว่าไปหาคนที่รู้เรื่องมาซึ่งทำให้แรงงานเนี่ยไม่มีโอกาสที่จะไปหาคนมาช่วยตัวเองนะฮะอันที่3เนี่ยการเลือกปฏิบัติต่างๆที่มีการเลือกปฏิบัติจากหน่วยงานต่างๆที่เกี่ยวข้องนะฮะเช่นกรมคุ้มครองสิทธิ์เมื่อก่อนนี้กรมคุ้มครองสิทธิ์คดีข่มขืนจะไม่มีเงินเยียวยาให้กับผู้ต้องคดีเหยื่อที่เป็นแรงงานข้ามชาติที่ไม่มีเอกสารนะเขาก็ยังถูกเลือกปฏิบัติแต่ปัจจุบันเนี่ยทาง HCDF ได้ฟ้องแล้วก็มีคำสั่งแล้วว่าให้จ่ายเงินเยียวยาในกรณีนี้ด้วยนะคะก็ได้ผ่านมา
Thank you. Sorry, I will have to stop you there. This has been really, really illuminating. And I think when we talk about a view from the ground, this is a view from the ground. I'm so grateful for your contribution. You highlighted so many key issues that, we have talked about all day today. Lack of, information, lack of support to get complaints filed, very basic things where there are severe gaps, but also the criminalization of victims, which is absolutely terrible. It's great to have laws, but if the laws fail the people they're designed to protect, then they're failing everybody. And I think the criminalization issue in the cases of labor trafficking victims, forced labor victims, is particularly compelling, and it is a reality that we deal with. I'm really grateful to you, and I really wish we had more time to talk, but I hope we can find you to talk some more. Are there any other questions in the room?
Thank you very much. I'll be mindful of the time. So my name is Besh Sunupong Nitiwana. My pronoun is she, her. I'm a founder and executive director of Young Pride Club. We're working on the LGBTQ youth in Chiang Mai, and we're also working with the human rights defender for LGBT sex worker as well. Today, I would like to raise one of the interesting and significant issue. These people, these two communities are significantly drive the economic of Thailand. The first one is the sex worker community, and the second one is the LGBT employee. Sex worker estimate the sex rate of the sex worker in Thailand is 6.4 million a year. This is the pre-COVID. However, Thailand do not recognize sex worker as a label, but they criminalize them. So we have the law that the anti-sex worker in Thailand makes sex working illegal. When sex working illegal, it's hard for officer to prevent them for discrimination at the workplace. So there are so many cases that sex worker got discriminated and violate their human rights. For example, if they want to leave at the work, they could not leave, and they was forced to drink the alcohol. And if they want to leave the work, they have to pay for themselves to go out of the work. Second of all, if they gain weight, they doesn't look nice, the employer would deduct the amount of the income per day of them. In addition to that, you may think that, what about the human trafficking? What about the child protection? We also have those laws in Thailand that protect human trafficking, protect the child protection, but this anti-prostitute or sex worker in Thailand was used as a tool for bribery, used as a tool to charge the money for the sex worker. So at the end of the day, during the COVID time, sex workers are faced a lot of severe challenges. For example, they lost their income, they lost their work, they suffer from the mental health. However, the Thai government do not have anything to help them access the remedy. At the end of the day, we today talk about NAP. NAP also do not include sex worker in their report, in their work.
Sorry, I'll have to stop you there, but I'm grateful to you.
Can I have like 30 minutes? Just
not 30
seconds,
minutes.
30 seconds, 10
I'm not
seconds,
sure
sorry.
I can stay here for 30 minutes.
So at the end of the day, I would like to say we have to decriminalize sex worker, and Thailand have to stop napping and stop napping and don't use nap as a tool to I didn't talk about LGBT, but stop using NAP as a tool to rainbow watching, and sex work is work. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your intervention. It's gratefully received, as you can tell. I'd like to go to one question which we had online, which I think all the panelists can probably have a stab at answering very briefly. It's a question from Winrock, and it's about remediation. With remediation, what are multinational companies' obligation to remediate violations that occur in their supply chains? What happens if suppliers down the supply chain do not have the resources to remediate workers, or say buyers are not paying them enough to afford remediation? So this raises the question of the SMEs who are further down the supply chain. What happens with remediating their workers if they don't have the resources or the affordability to? So Pepe, do you want to throw some thoughts on that, or shall I go to Andre? Andre?
Yeah, so the business model that we're in puts a lot of pressure on migrant workers, and it also puts pressure on businesses. And I think local suppliers are often caught in the middle, where they are receiving mandates from their buyer partners, but in their view, we hear this all the time from local suppliers, right? That they are receiving mandates but not receiving additional funds to be able to cover those additional mandates. So, I think as to what should happen, I mean, we would love to be able to see in prices for products factor in fair labor costs and fair, including progressive policies and appropriate policies like the employer pays principles. And I think as those policies become more the norm across the industry, there should be solid economic foundations to be able to charge additional prices. I'll let Tony, the expert, talk about that.
Well, it's our requirement that we expect our first-tier supplier to cascade our requirement to their sub-tier suppliers. But we do hope that the practice, the strong practices that we have will have good trickle-down effect to sub-tier suppliers. But one of the things that we're doing, as I said, we're barely scratching the surface. We're still doing due diligence on our tier 1 suppliers. But with all the mandatory due diligence requirements coming up, we are now actively looking at mapping our supply chain and how we can work further down into the supply chain One of the things that we do is we do support our suppliers in terms of helping them. We have one supplier that we supported in helping out pay off some of the recruitment fees for their migrant workers, right? But that's on a case by case basis. But we do that. But we do hope that the strong business case that we have do encourage our own tier one suppliers to really cascade the similar practice to their suppliers.
I mean, an interesting concept in the UN Guiding Principles is the use of commercial leverage. And this is exactly where you would expect to see buyers using commercial leverage to be able to, facilitate remediation at supplier level. And also buyers are responsible for some of the most punishing purchasing practices. And therefore it is important, and you'll see this in the European due diligence law, where there is a requirement for buyers to invest in their extended supply chain. And the idea really is that you would help the smaller and medium-sized suppliers who can't afford things like remediation, infrastructure, etc., to be providing a lot more support. And that's another thing that can be considered as well. There is another question here online, and this is the final one I'll take before going to final thoughts from the panelists. How are employers using digital technology to boost migrant workers' access to remedy? Can you take us, Pepe? Briefly, please.
And maybe just quickly also to answer the issue that was raised from the floor on the cost of regular migration, the difficulty of regular migration in this region, and the kind of ensuing irregular migration, and then those costs. I mean, we know that in this region, in the Greater Mekong sub-region in particular, irregular migration is much easier and cheaper than regular pathways. So that means that migrants do tend to come here through irregular pathways. That makes them highly vulnerable. Also, there's a certain structural tolerance of recruitment fees that's even legislated in the national laws. And so that goes very much against then, for example, what we do with the recruiter pays principle and what's written, for example, in the UN Guiding Principles. But it's a murky space where national governments, national actors believe that they're acting very lawfully. But we've seen that the private sector has been a great mover on this, and the large brands and the buyers in insisting on some of these principles and in asking to see that cascade through the supply chain. So that's been really positive. With regards to use of technology with enhancing the worker voice, yes, I mean, I think technology has been one of those disruptors in this space, which has allowed the anonymous representation of workers' grievances and issues within the workplace in a way that we haven't seen before, and we've seen a lot of private sector entities, NGOs, work in this space and starting to provide solutions, working together with the private sector partners and ensuring that migrants' voices are heard. And it's something that's quite interesting to see where it goes.
Thank you. We haven't heard from Celso. Celso, you're not out of sight, out of mind. So any final, very brief thought from you? Oh, have we lost Celso already?
On our part, it's more of any state-based mechanism on the protection and assistance to our workers will never be successful without without the participation of other stakeholders, the NGOs, international organizations, the workers themselves, in the development of different policies and different mechanisms. On the part of the Philippines, one thing that maybe that put us ahead or somehow that put our at par our overseas migration system is that first is the treatment on our migrant workers. For us, migrant workers are new day heroes, and we have seen it numerous times in the past pandemic. What gives the economy of the country floating, or the assistance or the help, the immense contribution of our modern day heroes. I think it's more of one thing is mindsetting, prioritizing them, looking at their immense contribution to the country's economy and country's well-being. It's more, and likewise, part of the government is bringing back the needed protection, the needed mechanism to assist them and to protect them. That's how we look at it here in the Philippines.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Celso. And perhaps I'll just wrap up here, being mindful of time. I think there is a lot to be said for the fact that we have a window of opportunity. There has never been so much more focus on grievances, on remediation, remedial mechanisms today as ever before, for the simple fact that the emergence of the human rights due diligence regimes also comes hand in hand with the need to look at systems to identify risk and also to manage risk. And there can be no better system of managing risk than to have a grievance system which is proactive, which is dynamic, which is resilient, but more importantly, which speaks to the needs of the people it is designed for. What does that mean in practice? It means that migrant workers have to be involved in the design, implementation, and delivery of these systems. Why don't we try to live with this thought? Indulge me for a moment. Let's reframe the way we think about grievance mechanisms. This is not a negative, let's hide it in the closet thing. Rather, let's think about it as a form of engagement and dialogue between employer and employee. Let's think about it as a way of the company continuously learning, these recruitment agents are getting in between. This is how they're extorting the workers. Here's how we need to tweak our due diligence systems in order to make it work for our workers. Why could we not do that? Why can we not see grievance systems as an expression of rights as opposed to something which always has to be negative? This requires a change of mindset, it requires vision, and it needs companies to go beyond a compliance mindset. Tick boxing is no longer enough. If you want to future-proof your business, you want to keep rights holders central, you need a lot more than compliance. You need a change in mindset and you need vision. Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you to the panelists.